Hi, my name is Erica Robinson. I am a naturopathic doctor in the state of Texas and a registered holistic nutritionist. And I share some kind of different things on my health podcast. Typically, I speak to ADHD, but I wanted to talk this week about my birth story with my fourth child, my first boy. His name is Jordan. And I thought it was a really cool story to share, so I want to share it here because I love listening to other people's stories. And I think that it can contribute to the body of knowledge that we have about birth, or at least people's experiences of birth, because I chose to do a free birth with Jordan in a wild pregnancy, and I'll explain what that means. And so I was put onto this concept by my friend and colleague, Aglaé Jacob. She's an author of several like paleo nutrition books and cookbooks that I used to own before I went totally digital. And she's great. She is now working with women in new ways around nutrition. And she was the one who put me on to free birth. And actually, her daughter and my daughter in 2021 were born 9 or 10 days apart. And she had just had her daughter, and I just had reconnected with her, and I was about to give birth. And that's when she told me about it. And I thought, oh my God, like I'm due any day now. And I'm not set up mentally or physically for free birth, although you can free birth whenever the heck you want. I'm just a bit of a slower moving person, and I have to integrate things into my psyche in a different way. So I've heard of stories of women who find out about free birth and like decide right then and there that they're going to do it. And then like the next day they go into labor and they do it. And that's amazing. And that's just not me. So she put me onto it then, but I was like, oh, I feel like it's too late for me right now. I had midwife births with all three of my daughters. And I thought that was great, especially compared to the status quo hospital birth, but I still had qualms with every single one of my midwife births. And I felt like none of them followed my birth plan, and all of them engaged in interventions, even when I was saying no or didn't want them, because they asserted that some kind of emergent thing was happening. So, for instance, in my first birth with my daughter, I didn't want oxytocin administered after I gave birth because there is data showing that giving a woman oxytocin will increase her risk of postpartum depression, which I had with all three of my daughters, and it could be for a multitude of reasons. But I'm prone to depression anyways, just in my genetics, in my family, so I didn't want that risk. And even so, like at the time, I just didn't want to be playing around with exogenous hormones like that. You have to excuse my stuttering because I don't talk to a lot of humans, like 8 weeks postpartum. And even before that, I wasn't talking to a lot of humans. I was just like sitting in my house getting ready for this. And I have very minimal interactions outside of my family at this stage of my life, and that's just what it is. So if I'm grasping for the right word in English, or if I'm stuttering, that's why. So, anyways, with all of my births, I had concerns. So, she said that midwife said I was going to quote unquote bleed out if she didn't give it to me right away. And like without me even having a chance to say anything, she jabbed me with it. Now, I think there's a lot that could have been done. I don't believe I was bleeding out. When I read the report, like my patient record, I didn't even lose 500 mils of blood. And like, that's, that's very normal. And so, what was she intervening about if I hadn't even gone over the amount of blood yet? And also, furthermore, they, another thing they did that I did not want them to do was they manage the third stage of labor, which is to say they pull out your placenta forcibly. And in my thought around this, and in what I've heard other women say as well, and people who are in the birth world, is that managing the third stage of labor causes more bleeding because you're not allowing the placenta to cleave off by itself. So there was that too. So was I bleeding more profusely in her eyes because she ripped my placenta out, She also ruptured my membranes when I was in labor, and that was like extremely painful for me. That was more painful than any other aspect of the birth, to be honest. Maybe coming in competition with the ring of fire, but like contractions were not as bad as that was for me for whatever reason. So it's just things like this, right? In my second birth, I was like, I wanted to give birth in my shower standing up, and they forced me to go to the bedroom and lay on the bed on my back so they could see what was going on. And just all this stuff that I feel like, why would you have to do that? Why do you have to see what's going on? Like, why does this process have to be observed? Why do my legs have to be spread? so you can see a clear picture of what's going on. That was really disruptive to me. And also there was a lot of anxiety, it occurred to me, around pushing and coached pushing and forced pushing with that birth. And like that, I'm sure my daughter was going to come out with the fetal ejection reflex, and then they're telling me to push as though it's some kind of emergent thing that she needs to come out right away. And she comes flying out, and she's in a state of severe distress, and she cried for 45 minutes straight. And so I feel like that was uncalled for and unnecessary. And then with my third birth, again, they managed the third stage of labor. They pulled out my placenta, even when I asked them not to. There was profuse bleeding in my eyes when I looked down and saw how much blood I had lost, which was more significant than any of the other two births. And I feel like they administered the oxytocin because I had bled so much. So again, there you go. So I had qualms with all three births with my midwives. And not only that, and there's other details that I'm sure I'm forgetting, but there are other factors I was unhappy with all of the births. And I was also unhappy with the pregnancy monitoring as well, which is why I opted for a wild pregnancy. A wild pregnancy is a pregnancy where you go unmonitored, or you can, do it as you please, because nothing is set in stone. You don't have to do anything. In fact, most of what doctors, like physicians and midwives, do is not even evidence-based. So it's quite pointless. So you can either have a totally wild pregnancy, or you can do something like that, where you choose which elements you want to engage in your care. And I opted for wild pregnancy because of the problems I had. So with my first daughter, there was a scare around that she might have Down syndrome, because something was something to do with her nuchal ligament or something like this. They do a bunch of tests, both a scan and a blood work, to see. It's called the triple screen, to see if there's an increased likelihood of Down syndrome, and there was. And then they said that I should get the additional testing, which is rather invasive, to find out more definitively if she was. And I declined that, but that added a lot of unnecessary stress to my life. And furthermore, if I had done the additional testing, there's a risk of miscarriage, right? So it's like that kind of screen is now putting me into an awkward position where it's like, do you really want and need to find out if this child has Down syndrome? Because if you do, it's going to put you at risk of losing the child. So I decided against it, and I've never done that test ever since, because I believed, what was the point? Was I going to, if I found out the child had Down syndrome, would I abort them? No. So what was the point for that? I understand some people want to be aware of what's coming up, but I decided that no matter what, I would be ready to deal with it. That was my personal choice. But so that was the thing in that pregnancy, that she might have Down syndrome and the stress around that. And then in the second pregnancy, the issue was at her anatomical ultrasound, they thought she had a clubbed foot. And so they started talking to me about changing my plan from a home birth to a hospital birth, not just hospital, but a high risk hospital birth. And I was very confused. I was like, so what does the club foot, okay, first of all, how likely is it she actually has club foot? And I looked into the statistics, and I don't know them anymore, but it was something like the ultrasound technician can be wrong quite a lot of the time. So already I was like, I don't know that she definitively has clubfoot. Secondly, why do we have to go to a hospital to give birth? My midwife said, well, because the orthopedic surgeon wants to consult with you right away if they're born with clubfoot. And I said, is he or she going to do surgery right away? And she said, no, typically you have to wait several months before that. And then I was like, so this makes no sense to me. So it's not an emergent issue when they're born. They're not going to live or die based on the status of clubfoot. But yet you want me to be there just simply to consult with the orthopedic surgeon over a condition she may not even have. She said, correct. And I said, well, if I don't do that and I give birth at home and she has a club foot, can you write me a referral to an orthopedic surgeon? Absolutely, she said. So I don't know, the math isn't mathing for me, and maybe that's how you feel too when you hear this kind of story. It's a little bit ridiculous. So I thought to myself, well, if there's no dire need, I think her overall thing was you'll get quicker access to the orthopedic surgeon if you give birth in hospital. And so I'm doing the math too on, well, what are the risks of giving birth in the hospital? And if you're a healthy mother with a healthy baby, and even if you don't even know the status of your baby, Like, there's quite a few risks to giving birth in the hospital, which you'd have to do your due diligence and look up yourself and feel comfortable about. Because I don't think it's my place, and I'm not an expert in birth at this moment to be telling people things of this nature. I'm just sharing with you my story and my thoughts. But so I'm weighing out the pros and cons of, like, do I go to the hospital to give birth just so I can see the orthopedic surgeon marginally sooner over a condition that is not fatal and she might not even have. So I decided against that, and I gave birth at home, and sure enough, her foot was fine. So there's that. Now, with a third pregnancy rather, again an issue came up, and it was that the ultrasound tech said my third daughter's organs were developing outside of her body. Her stomach was developing outside of her body. Something of that nature, and it was like my medical doctor called me because I started off that pregnancy journey with my family doctor, and then I transferred to the midwives. Whereas with the other ones, I started right away with the midwives, but there was a wait list with the third one. So I was waiting, working with him, and he's the one that called me and told me the ultrasound report. And then he said this, um, he's like, I know that sounds scary, but like this ultrasound clinic is not known particularly for doing prenatal scans. They do like other kinds of, like, for issues with your bladder and so forth, or other uterine issues, not necessarily pregnancy. So he said, I don't think that I don't think this ultrasound technician is highly trained in interpreting these scans. And furthermore, it's normal for the organ. I think he says it's normal for the organs to develop outside of the body. And it was like 7 weeks of pregnancy, right? 8 weeks. And I'm pretty sure from my vague memory of anatomy and embryology that that's correct. He said something of this nature. He's like, what she's seeing is normal and she's thinking it's pathological. He's like, but if it's kind of hard to identify to begin with at 8 weeks. So he said, you can go to like a class, I think it's called a class 3 hospital, like a more advanced hospital with more advanced imaging and experienced technicians. And you can do another ultrasound and find out. He's like, but honestly, I probably wouldn't worry about it right now. He's like, I have to tell you legally, I have to convey all this to you, but it's up to you what you want to do. And I just thought, and he was great. He, like, what bizarro world are we in when the medical doctor is like more reasonable than the midwives are? But that's what's happened. That's what's become of things. And I think it's because medical doctors do sort of run the show here, and he has more power. Like, he's less likely to lose his license if he's a little bit ballsy than a midwife is. I think midwives have to adhere to the laws and not sharing their own opinions and so forth because they're just at a higher risk. This is just my perception. I have no idea if this is true. But that's how it seems to me. And like, in what world is he more realistic and truthful than my midwives have been historically? And so I wouldn't say it was like that the pregnancy was ruined by a midwife, but I would say that it was kind of thrown off kilter and had additional stress added to it just by virtue of not being a wild pregnancy, just by virtue of having that scan done and then having this like unrealistic risk now, or scare really, about my daughter's health and was she developing okay. So there was that. And so for those reasons, so you can see that I had qualms with all of my pregnancies being monitored the way that they were. And then I had qualms with all of my births being intervened in the way that they were. And so when my friend Agley reached out, and like, she didn't even reach out, I was just commenting on, her posts on Instagram and whatnot. And then she told me about this whole thing of free birth and wild pregnancy. I decided that was for me if I were to get pregnant again. And sure enough, after I had that daughter that I'm talking about, the third daughter, I got pregnant in just over a year and a half later. And so I decided to have a wild pregnancy and not be monitored at all. So for full transparency, with my fourth pregnancy, I did actually, in the very beginning, I was working with a new doctor who did not know my history, or as well, I guess they don't. They have access to your online charts, but I think it's a lot of work to look through all of it. Anyway, they did send me for a scan early on again, which in retrospect I probably wouldn't do again, but just to confirm that it wasn't, I can't even recall the word. This is how sleep deprived I am, and not from the newborn, but from my other toddlers. ectopic, that's the word I'm looking for. They just wanted to confirm that it wasn't an ectopic pregnancy, which was kind of weird, but I've never had one. I don't have history of that. I don't have history of endometriosis, which would increase the risk. But anyway, this is just what they did. So that we confirmed the pregnancy via ultrasound. And I also did basic blood work in the beginning to confirm the pregnancy and some other parameters. Like they do basic standard testing when you get pregnant. So whatever those were, I ran, like a complete blood count and such. And then they look at about your immunity and sexually transmitted infections and stuff, which you don't even really need. You don't need to do any of this. Um, yeah, this is just food for thought. But so for full transparency, I did have like not a completely wild pregnancy. And it doesn't matter. Like no one's awarding gold stars for how little or how much you do. It's whatever you feel comfortable with. And I was okay with that at the time. And I hadn't yet done the free birth course and heard the information around ultrasound scans, especially with a younger developing baby. And I wouldn't do those again. That's just from what I've heard and seen with the research, I wouldn't do those again. So anyways, that's, the backstory of how I got to where I was. And I have to say, it was the most peaceful pregnancy out of all four. It was the most peaceful. There was no stress for me from weird results on ultrasound scans. There was no stress of having to get to an appointment all the damn time and like try to configure it in a way that fits my schedule. To gather information that wasn't even evidence-based and wouldn't really contribute to my birth or pregnancy in any way. So there's all that. And don't take my word for it. You'd have to look into the risks yourself and the research yourself and decide for you what makes sense. But for me, it wasn't going to further anything. And I knew that I would seek care if there were red flags present, and there were not. So this is just how we end up where we are, where I'm having this, delightful, uneventful pregnancy. I would say in a lot of ways it was the hardest and the easiest pregnancy. I've never had this bad heartburn in my life. So that part was hard. But I mean, that's not a red flag, right? It was the easiest pregnancy in terms of I didn't have to do anything or go anywhere or be monitored or have all of these ridiculous tests that don't really add up to much for me. And it was great. And I'm sure there's things I'm missing that I should be saying that I just can't think of right now. But all in all, I really loved that it was this low stress. And for some reason, I just had this vibe on myself that I wasn't going to talk about my pregnancy and birth, and it was nobody's business. And it wasn't coming from a place of like being angry or upset or like, don't effing talk to me about this. It was more like, no, it's just not up for discussion. Like, I'm not, wanting to talk about it. It's not a point of excitement for me. It's not something I want to fight about either. I'm not like passionate to fight about it. I think that would generate too much stress in my body anyways. So I don't know. I just decided that it was going to be like this low key pregnancy. And I guess that was the vibe I gave off, because there are people in my family that would typically always ask me, so like, are you doing the 20-week ultrasound? How are the visits going? What's the doctor saying? Like, there's people that have asked that for all three pregnancies. And then on this fourth one, did not ask a single question, or they were just like, how are you doing? And then there were also a ton of people who did not even acknowledge that I was pregnant. Like, I work with a functional MD. I shouldn't say did not acknowledge, but like, it was almost like they didn't notice that I was pregnant. Like, I would go into my functional MD's office and we were working on completely other things around my ADHD and dopamine levels together, because I believe even experts should have experts, and it's better to put, two or more good brains together and come up with really cool ideas. So, but I would go in there and she would never like belabor or bemoan the point that I'm pregnant and like, oh, you need to do this and that, or like change this and that, or, obviously she didn't recommend anything that was unsafe in pregnancy, but like, it wasn't even a point. Whereas I remember going with my other three pregnancies, anyone I worked with would be like, oh my God, you're so pregnant. Like, it was just such a point of conversation. So I don't know if it was my vibe or the fact that it's like my fourth pregnancy, and so people are thinking to themselves, she's done this 3 times before already. I'm sure she's got this in the bag, like it's handled. I don't know what the element was, but for whatever reason, it was like the most unspoken about pregnancy. And typically, too, people ask about your birth. And like, my family knows I've had midwives for all 3 of my births. I've had home births. And they didn't even ask about that. They didn't even say, like, so you're gonna have a home birth again? I think, my mom asked me like once or twice if I had a midwife, just like a random offhand, we're just having a conversation over coffee or tea or whatever. And I was like, oh yeah, I'm looking into it. I'm looking into my options. And it was just no, it wasn't really a big point of discussion. I mean, it's understandable, right? If it was my first baby, people were freaking out a lot more. And they're like, home birth, oh my God, that sounds crazy. And now home birth is no longer taboo and midwives are no longer taboo. But like the next thing is free birth. That's so weird. That's so different, right? Even though that's what we as humans did for thousands of years, and that's what mammals have been doing for hundreds of thousands of years. I'm sure humans have been doing it for hundreds of thousands of years, considering we've been humaning for like 350,000 years. It's only in the past few hundred years that birth has become this super medicalized event, right? So anyway, it's so weird to everybody when you mention free birth, but it's yet what we did for the vast, vast, vast majority, 99%, if not more, of our existence as a species. And then people will say the whole, like, yeah, but a lot of people die during birth. And, you've got to look into those statistics for yourself about why that happened. But there are confounding variables around that, such as, pre-germ theory, doctors were walking from like the morgue to the pregnant woman and delivering her baby, and then she was dying of some kind of septic infection. So there's stuff you have to look into and feel comfortable with, and that's not the purpose of this podcast. It's more, I just wanted to share like my thinking around it, and if anything, it could be a jump off point for you to go look into it more yourself. And I highly recommend the Free Birth course, and I think it's just called Free Birth Society if you Google that. And their course, I got it on sale, on Black Friday sale, for like $200. So really, really cool, very informative, 27 hours of content. I did not finish it, and I actually had a lot of anxiety about not finishing it, but then I decided to not care at the end. I think I missed like the last few modules, and it was fine. It was completely fine. But it will prepare you, and it will show you the data and evidence around different things, and you can make decisions from there. And so the pregnancy was great. And now I'll tell you the actual birth story. So I'm sure we've gotten like quite a ways in. And you're probably just wanting to hear the birth story, but a lot of women are interested in the backstory too, because a lot of us navigate pregnancy and birth, and we're kind of thinking like, what the F is going on? Why are things the way that they are? Why are they in a way that doesn't suit me? And I will say that going through this process of both doing the course and having the wild pregnancy and having the free birth as like the final, cherry on top, it also made me very angry and also grieve how my other births went. And previously I had sort of put them in my back pocket, like that is done, that is now complete, that experience is behind me. But I still had some resistance and some resent around how things went down, as I told you in the beginning, like things my midwives did, which by all accounts are not that bad when you consider I could have had C-sections, I could have had the, cascade intervention of cascades or whatever they're called. When you just have one thing after another. I was never induced. I never had my membranes like stretch and sweep. Never induced in that sense, never given Pitocin during labor. I never took antibiotics during labor. I was never strapped to the bed, unable to move. I didn't have constant fetal monitoring with most of my births. I did with my first in the last bit, so that was annoying too. But so, women will talk to me and they're like, you're so lucky. Like, you didn't fall down that rabbit hole and down that pathway of having to go through all these interventions. And a lot of women, say that they want natural birth and home birth, but then something comes up and they get rerouted to the hospital and it's a whole thing. And hospitals will always kind of make up something, or it's real to them usually, about why, you should have been there and why, like, oh, it's so good that you came into the hospital because your baby's cord was wrapped around its neck. It's so good you did a C-section because they would have died. And that's usually not true at all. But then the women will use that as being like, oh, thank God. And I think that they sell them this way so that they can say, well, it's good that I went to the hospital because he would have died. But most babies' cords are wrapped around their neck. Most babies are born with the cord around their neck. You just slip it off over their head. All of my babies had the cord around their neck. It's completely fine. I'm not going to say there isn't a very, 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 very tiny percentage of births that should happen in the hospital, of course. But you would know either in the pregnancy things would be going on, or with the birth itself, there's a couple of, red flags that you would look for that are included in that free birth course, such as cord prolapse. And you'd be like, I have to get to the hospital now. Absolutely. But I would say by and large, the vast majority probably could have been prevented. I'm not going to get into that whole can of worms, but my point is, a lot of women talk to me and they're like, your births were so good compared to mine. So like, well, what are you complaining about? And then so I didn't complain at all for a long, long time, but I still had that bit of resent toward each experience. And so I'll say that going through the course, it sort of reopened it all for examination and for healing. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's actually a way to heal. Like, you're just sort of leaving a festering wound for many years, and then you decide to like cut it open and let the toxicity flow out, and then actually heal at a deep core level. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think it's actually beneficial. So my experience with rehashing it involved that. It involved being angry. Like, I was angry at how things went, and then I was learning from this course about how things could have gone. I was learning why my midwives behaved the way that they did. I was learning why that field is just becoming another medical field. And it was upsetting and it was saddening. And I cried. I remember listening to the modules at my gym in the hot tub and crying, like tears streaming down my face. And I ended up processing all of this and, feeling the feels and going through it and releasing it from my body and deciding that I wanted something different. I will say that the birth itself, like, I had a lot of fear. I had a lot of fear because we've been programmed, right? I mean, every single movie I've seen with a woman giving birth. For whatever reason, I decided to watch Game of Thrones while I was pregnant, and that was different about this pregnancy. Was with my girls, I couldn't watch anything gory or violent, or I was extremely hypersensitive to normal. And yeah, with the with the boy pregnancy, and this could, I don't know why, like maybe I'm just making this up, but the boy pregnancy was so different in that I was craving these quite violent shows. Like, I don't know why. And shows with like masculine leadership and strong leaders and like Jon Snow, right, from Game of Thrones, and these kinds of role models. And I wasn't sensitive to it at all. And I was like, bring it on. And watching series like The Witcher and whatnot, and Viking shows and things. So unfortunately, in those kind of like old-timey settings, all the women are friggin' dying in childbirth. So I'm highly pregnant and I'm watching all these women die in childbirth. If you've watched Game of Thrones, there's like at least 4 or 5 deaths during childbirth. So of course we've got this trauma embedded in our friggin' psyche about this, right? And this is what we've seen and been exposed to. Like, birth is scary. You're probably going to die. Thank God for medicine, because women died before this. It just doesn't make sense to me that a species would propagate if death was so likely during pregnancy and birth. It's just like, how did we maintain that for 350,000 years and even all of the years prior to that in our evolution as mammals? It's very confusing. Nevertheless, I was scared. I was scared. Like, I knew birth was coming up and I was scared about it. And I'm just being completely honest with you. Like, I had two home births and 1 hospital birth. All of them were midwife attended. And I'd felt what it's like to be in labor and to give birth and to have the ring of fire. Like, that was not new to me, but this experience of like, I'm going to have to be alone. I'm going to go it alone. And that was, to take this to another level, I decided fairly early on that I wanted to give birth completely alone. Now, this all occurred because before I ever had kids, I had this like dream of, oh my God, it's gonna be so romantic. My husband and I was single when I had these dreams. Whoever's gonna be my husband, he's gonna be like holding me, and it's gonna be this romantic, bringing our child into this world, and we love each other so much. And what actually happened, especially with my first daughter, her dad was not at the birth, but I had a lot of attendance at the birth. Too many people. That's a common pattern for women, is they invite too many people to the first birth. And with the second birth, her dad was there. It was a different dad now, and with a different person, and have 3 children with him. But I didn't want anything to do with anyone. I was like, leave me in the bathroom in the dark alone. And just, the best parts of my labor were when I was completely alone. And then he checked on me. He checked on me and he saw that I was quite far along. And he's the one that called the midwives. And then they came, and then it just felt like there were too many people in my space. And after that, I started doing research into like, how do tribal people give birth? How do modern day hunter gatherers give birth? And I remember reading this one paper about the Amazonians, like the women from one Amazonian tribe going out into the forest alone, or maybe with a mother or sister or girlfriend. And they would stand, which is what I had the inclination to do in the shower before the midwives told me to go lay down. They would stand almost like in a semi-squat position, not quite like a deep squat, nothing like that, but just like sort of standing with their knees bent, their hips bent, and push the baby out into a pile of leaves and like pick them up and put them in a carrier and go back to the tribe. So I just thought, I'm like, that's what I want. I want to be alone. I don't know. I just want to be alone. That just felt right for me personally. And I want to be in the dark, just like I was with that second birth. And that's what I created for this fourth birth, was like, I want to be completely alone. And a lot of people think that's so weird, but it's actually the best, because being unobserved during your labor allows things to progress really quickly and easily compared to if you are observed. It's just the way the mammalian hormones function. Like if you have a cat that's going into labor, they usually hide under a porch or in the back of your closet, right? They're not like, oh, everybody watch me give birth in broad daylight. Darkness facilitates the flow of the hormones for labor as well. So I don't really vibe with this whole thing of like giving birth in broad daylight. I've seen a lot of women do it happily, but it just doesn't feel right to me or normal. And so I decided, like, I knew I was going to give birth at night, because I always do. And then I knew I was going to give birth alone. And so I was scared for that too. I was like, just because you make a choice doesn't mean you feel 100% like happy about it, but it was my choice and I was scared, is my point. And so I did, I did a lot of visualization in the shower in my pregnancy, especially in the third trimester, because I was like, wait, like, what are the steps I'm going to take? What am I going to do? How am I going to handle each phase of labor? Let me think this through before it happens. And so I would visualize going into labor, having contractions, getting into the same shower I was right now sitting and visualizing in. And I would allow the water to soothe me. And thank God we had a tankless water heater, so we have unlimited hot water. And yes, I did pay like $200 on that water bill, but it's a very minor cost for giving birth. That's one of my only costs. And so I visualized coming into the shower. It was going to be dark. I told the dad like what to do. I told him, this, when I go, I'm not going to tell anyone. If you find out, I don't want you to tell anyone. I don't want my mom texting. I don't want your mom texting. I don't want anyone knowing or interfering or like being a part of the space. So anyways, he knew the drill. I visualized that my other children would not be awake. They would be fast asleep and stay asleep. And yeah, I also visualized having the bathtub full of water and potentially having a water birth. So that was part of it too. I'm sure there's other things I'm not thinking about. Oh yeah, a key for me that I gathered from my second birth was that I have to be constantly moving. For me, if I'm moving, if every muscular action I take is equal to or greater than the muscular action of my uterus contracting, it overrides it. So, I just try to meet each sensation with an equal or stronger reaction, whether that's squatting, lunging, whatever. So I pictured myself moving a lot. I pictured the baby crowning and what I would do, and I pictured delivering the baby myself. I pictured all those things night after night. I was like, this. And I knew too that I was doing this all with a calm, rational mind. And I knew in the moment of giving birth that I would not necessarily have great access to that mind. I would be in more of an emotional state, typically more of a high state. Like you do get high in a certain sense from all of the hormones. But I also knew that it was a very instinctual state, and that might be beneficial to override the logic. So I just kind of kept that embedded in my head of like, here's what you're going to do. Okay, so I've told you all of the backstory, how the pregnancy was, and what I decided to do and why. And now, as for this birth, I was expecting it to go late because usually, like, two of my pregnancies have gone to almost 42 weeks, and one of them was a day earlier than the due date, my second one. So I anticipated this was going to go late, but I was really struggling at the end. I had a lot of varicose veins. They were generating a lot of pain in my body. I had severe heartburn. I was kind of asking this child to come. I was like, I'm struggling. I can't foresee more time than this. And he came 10 days early to his due date. But at this point, I was thinking it was going to be a 42-week pregnancy. So I'm like, oh my God, it's still like 3 weeks away. I was like, I can't take 3 more weeks of suffering. It was very bad for me at the end. And again, it's not red flags, but it's stuff that just very uncomfortable. And so he actually was born 10 days early. What happened though was on the Tuesday, I woke up at 2 in the morning and I thought that I had peed myself, which is not totally uncommon. I had a lot of incontinence in this pregnancy because I have a like bladder prolapse, like weak pelvic floor from previous pregnancies that I haven't worked on enough to strengthen. I was like, did I like pee myself in bed or what is happening? And then I got up and it was just like this slow, continuous leak. And I was like, this has to be my waters breaking. But it was not a gush. It was just this slow, sort of annoying. Anytime I stood up, it would just leak out. I was like, I'm not peeing. I don't have to pee. This really took me a while to discern what the hell was going on. Yeah, this really took me a while to figure it out. And I remember messaging my friends and being like, did your waters break this way? What was it like? And the reason this was weird to me is because my water has never broken before. It only breaks while I'm giving birth. And I used to think, my membranes were stronger because I had enough collagen in my diet and whatnot, and vitamin C. And maybe that's true, maybe it's not. But they weren't as strong this time, let's put it that way. The waters broke and slow leak. And it lasted till like 4 in the morning. And then finally I decided to go back to bed. It lasted all throughout the day. So it was highly annoying. And then I was, looking up how normally if your water breaks, you have to like get to the hospital within 24 hours if you're doing a normal pregnancy, quote unquote normal. But I was like, hey, that's weird. What's going to happen if I don't? And then I remember messaging my other friends who've done free births and be like, oh my God, am I going to get a friggin' infection? And apparently I hadn't gotten to that module yet. And apparently that's like such a low risk. So I was like, okay. So 24 hours passed, nothing happened. And then we're into 36 hours now, and it's like daytime on a Thursday. And I was like, oh, I have a sudden burst of energy. That should have been my sign. I have a sudden burst of energy. I should like get all this nesting done, all these final tasks on the to-do list done. And I was all over town. I've never shopped so much in the entire pregnancy, like getting all the final last things I needed. Sure that there's like 3 weeks to go. I was like, I'll go pick up all these things that I need so that I don't need to worry about it. And the thing is, all day long, I have IBS. So, like, I have pain on and off depending on what foods I've been exposed to. And all day, I was like, damn, like, I'm really having a lot of IBS cramping. Like, this is painful. What did I eat? Like, what's doing this? And it would just stop me in my tracks. I'd be driving my car or, like, walking around a store and I'd be like, wow, that's painful. What the hell did I do? What did I eat? So strange. And, in hindsight, what I think it was is I've never not had the water. I've never not had the cushioning. But now I didn't have the water and the cushioning, and the baby is like directly smashing onto the back of my cervix, which is a lot more painful as a contraction than if they are cushioned. If that makes sense. But yeah, honestly, it was weird. I've never had that sensation with labor before. So like that's strange, is it not? It could be your fourth pregnancy and like totally different sensations. But obviously it wasn't so bad because I thought it was IBS. And or is my IBS so bad that I'm just accustomed and it's easy for me to give birth because I'm used to being in pain all the time anyway. I grapple with this. Any of the patients I've spoken to who experienced dysmenorrhea as a teenager and young adult don't find birth that painful. So is it that they're a superstar at giving birth, or is it that they've been trained over their entire lifetime to handle severe amounts of pain? So if you're a woman who hasn't given birth and you have dysmenorrhea, like painful periods, you basically know what labor feels like. And I've known what labor feels like since I was 14. Just to put it into perspective, I've had extremely debilitating, like, can't work, can't go to school, probably need naproxen, but overdose on Tylenol kind of periods. So anyway, that was the kind of pain that I experienced. But I still thought, I was like, maybe this is one of those things where like it leaks, but it's going to reseal itself because that totally happens. Maybe I do still have 3 more weeks to go. Who knows? And I was just happily going about my day buying things. And I was like, oh, I only experienced not even 3 weeks of full freedom with both my daughters in daycare before the baby was born. So I was in week 3 of that, just enjoying my freedom that I hadn't had in like 3 years or whatever, 4 years. So yeah, that's where I was. And then that night, I remember talking to my neighbor at like 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, and she was like, "When's the baby gonna come?" I was like, "I don't know. Any day now would be great because I don't feel so hot." I'm like, I'm done with pregnancy. With each new pregnancy, I want to be pregnant for less time, or it hits me sooner that I don't want to be pregnant. It's just a tough thing for some people. It's not all like rainbows and unicorns for everybody. Anyway, it was just funny to me because I was putting out the recycling, talking to this neighbor and saying like it could be any day now. And then literally 1 hour later, I went into labor. I was putting my daughter to bed and I just started feeling, oh yeah, another backstory was like I'd been getting contractions like this for the entire, what would this put us at, like 40 hours of having my water be broken. For the entire 40 hours, if I would lie down and like chill out, contractions would come. And like I had tried to put my daughter to bed and they would start and then they would stop. And I'd be like, nothing's gonna happen. So I kept feeling like, and I was pissed off about the fact that my labor wasn't coming because my body felt unsafe because of the toddlers around me. So I was getting quite frustrated that I'm never gonna friggin' give birth because these toddlers are keeping me in a state of like fight or flight. But so this particular time we laid down and she actually fell asleep, my daughter. And then they started ramping up and it was 8:30 at this point. And I was like, okay, it's friggin' happening. What's funny is at 7, I had just dropped my daughter off at her school dance, and I had to go get her at 9. So it's like 8:30 right now. I went and took like a really brief shower, just like a cleansing shower for 15 minutes, just sort of get my head in the game. And I was like, yeah, this is really labor. Like it's really happening. I'm having regular contractions. I even timed them at the beginning. They were like 5 to 7 minutes apart. But then 8:45, I'm like, I gotta get out. I gotta go pick up my daughter at the dance for 9 o'clock. And so I remember like driving there and being, it was like such a beautiful sky. It was, the sun had set and it was like a really nice sky out and like the air was nice. And anyway, it was just a really good drive. And I thought to myself, like, it's good that I came out because the contractions were starting to be too much for me and I needed to put a brake on things, and this put a brake on my contractions. And I only had one on the way there, but then I had another one while I was sitting in the parking lot waiting for her. And then I drove back home and had another one on the way home, and it was like really severe because I'm not able to move. I'm like restricted by the car, and I can't move the way that I want to. And so when I can't move, they're super painful. And so I do remember distinctly that on the drive there, I was on this road doing the speed limit, but it was like a back road. And I had a contraction, and then all of a sudden there were like 3 cars that decided I was going too slow and had to drive around me. I was like, dude, I'm going 80. Is this not? Anyway, they sped past me, and I was like, forget it. Like, literally having contraction while driving. And her school's not far away, and I don't think it was dangerous. It was fine for me. But, I'm probably gonna get comments about that because I get comments about everything. So, anyways, I got there, I got her, and then what was funny is that on the drive back, there was this woman in front of us who was driving as if she's had never driven before or never seen this neighborhood, and she was so slow, and that's who I was having the contraction behind at one point, and I just decided at one point to just go past her. She was too much for me. I was like, are you freaking kidding me? Like, I need to get home now. I need to get in the shower. And it was like, 9:15, 9:20 by the time we got home. And I was like, Alice, I can't put you to bed. Like, I gotta go in the shower. And she's like, oh, God. And I remember, so it was dark, it was pitch black in my bathroom, and I've got this beautiful shower. It's like the size of a small closet. I'm really spoiled with this house. And the minute I walked into this house, we were looking at it to rent it. I was like, this bathroom would be perfect for giving birth. And sure enough, here we are, literally a year and 1 month later, and I'm giving birth in it. So it's got that shower and it's got this amazing soaker tub, like huge, deep soaker tub. So I started filling up this soaker tub with like pretty warm water. Not hot, I'm not gonna burn my baby, but you know what I mean. And this was where I really like the mindset piece was everything. And I'm from talking to people who want a home birth but don't and end up transferring, it's usually the mindset piece. I don't know. There's something really interesting to me. I was saying to a friend that like my most fit friends with the most musculature often get C-sections and have like the hardest time having a home birth. And one friend was like, "Oh yeah, it's probably because they're too tight. Like the muscles are too tight to deliver a baby vaginally." I don't know if that's true, and I don't know if it's a mindset thing or just that they're not expecting this. But it's just fascinating to me that this is how it goes down. And mindset is bigger than anyone ever realizes until you're in it. And what came to mind to me was that story about the two wolves. You know, there's this like native story of, you know, there's two wolves inside of me, and one is all about like greed, jealousy, envy, and hate, and one is all about like love and leadership and empathy. And then the grandson saying to the grandfather, like, how do you, you know, how do you ensure which wolf wins the fight? And he's like, it's which wolf that you feed. And this was coming to me because my whole labor at that point was half of me being like, oh my God, like, how long is this going to last? Are you going to die from this? You know, if you're still in labor by morning, you have to call 911. Like, you got to get transferred. You need an epidural. Like, just the chitter chatter that goes on. And, you know, it's probably informed by a lifetime of being programmed from media and our parents and whatever. And it just was like this nonstop ticker tape of bullshit. And then the other part of me would be like, you fucking got this. Like, this is fine. This is normal. This is what you've been through 3 times prior to this. There's nothing suggesting anything's wrong here. If you're thinking that way, in fact, it probably means that birth is imminent because right before giving birth, you typically think you're going to die. And I wish someone had told me that before I had my first daughter because I was really, really scared. And then my midwife was like, oh no, that's normal. Like, thinks they're dying and right before the baby comes out. And so, you know, that the good wolf in me was like, if you feel this way, you're probably really close to giving birth. No freaking way you're lasting until morning. It's like 10:30 probably at this point. And it was just this constant battle between the two sides of my brain. And it wasn't so much as which wolf I fed, as like which wolf I actively decided to murder on the spot. But it was like a slow, agonizing death, I tell you. And it was something else. And I had no one there. Like, there was no one there to pat me on the back or be like, you got this, or like, this is normal. And apparently, when I learn about birth attendants, like really good birth attendants, they don't say anything. They just like sit in the corner. So it's like they know that talking to the birthing woman is bullshit anyway. And I don't know, some women do benefit from that and like it, but like it's never really done anything for me. In fact, it's probably made things worse. But in this moment, I was like, I need to coach myself. I need to like tell myself what to think and do. And it was just, I can't get over how much of a struggle and a battle that was because my fears were very strong. And this is coming from someone who's had home births and midwife births and like not had access to a lot of medication and epidurals and stuff like that. So it's like, you would think it just sounds weird, right? Coming from somebody with that kind of a history, but it was what it was. And so I can't even imagine how difficult and challenging this might be for women who aren't um, accustomed to handling intensive sensations and pain. And so, anyways, but like I say, I think just to be a little bit dark for a second, I think my entire life of pain and chronic disease has somehow prepared me for handling an intense sensation like this. But anyway, you don't need that as a prerequisite. There's tons of women without chronic illness that give birth just fine. So that's just me being dark for a minute, like the whole dysmenorrhea thing. you've had dysmenorrhea, you know what it's like to be in labor. So I just coached myself through that. Contractions were a lot. The shower water was everything. Movement was everything. I met every contraction with, a greater movement, whether, like I said, it was squatting or lunging or dancing or jumping even, all kinds of stuff like that. Yeah, so it was very interesting to me. The shower water was incredible. The heat was great. The sensation was amazing. The movement was so good for feeling less of the contraction. So the way in my second birth, they didn't believe I was like in labor enough for the midwives to come because they were saying, like she's doesn't, it's not taking her breath away or like making her speak differently, which again was alerting me to the fact that I handle sensations very differently from the average person. And this might be you as well. And but they came and then they realized I was about to give birth. And she said to me, she's like, I think you actually are having, 1 minute long contractions or longer, but you're only feeling like 30 seconds of it. And of that, I only actually feel about 10 seconds of intensity. So when you put it that way, you're like, can you get through like a 10-second intensity and then it's over? That becomes a lot more doable than a 60-second intense moment. And so they were pretty close together. For me, the hardest part of labor is when there's no recovery period in between contractions, which typically happens right when you're about to be like fully dilated, fully effaced and dilated. So it's just like on top of another. It's like again and again and again, and there's no break. Like usually with the contraction, there's like a 2 to 5 minute break in between where you can just chill, but not at the end. At the end, and that's why you feel like you're dying. And so I do remember two distinct times when I took a nap in that labor. And the first one, I left the shower and I was like, let me just see what contractions are like on dry land, after the car experience, anyways. And I was in my room and I laid my forehead on my bed and I was on my knees, like kneeling onto my bed. And I just fell asleep. I fell asleep for 10 minutes. And I know because I was still looking at the time of everything. And I was actually quite lucid and not high for this labor. I was actually like quite with it and present. And I'm beginning to think that the high aspect is when you're in too much pain. You're like overproducing pain mediating chemicals and it's making you extremely loopy, which happened in my first birth. But I didn't feel that way with this one because I wasn't in a lot of pain. At least the way I was managing it didn't occur as painful for me. So I wasn't loopy. I was still watching the clock. I fell asleep for 10 minutes and I was woken up by a contraction. It was like one of the most painful ones ever because I was stationary. And I just remember thinking that like that nap was worth it. It was so good. Like 10 minutes of sleeping when you're in labor is so good and restorative. And I got back in the shower. I was in the shower for a bit. And by then, I had done the whole tub filling thing and the tub was full. And I decided to sit in the tub. I got into the tub and it was like so relaxing. Again, I fell asleep for 10 minutes. And again, I was awoken by a very intense contraction because I was stationary. But, pulling off 20 minutes of rest inside of a 2.5 hour labor is pretty amazing. And so my contractions were typically, very close together, except for those two times. They spaced right out to give me a break. And the same thing had happened when I drove to the school. They spaced right out and gave me a break. And then I just remember thinking, like, I cannot do another stationary contraction. Like, it's too much. It's too much to bear. It's so painful. I can understand why women, if they're like taped to the hospital bed for whatever reason, end up getting an epidural because this is so painful to be stationary like this. It's unbelievable. It's a night and day difference. Got back in the shower, continued moving, and then continued battling, the good wolf and the bad wolf, or whatever you want to call them, the dark and the light wolf, the yin and the yang. And I just worked through that, and I just kept telling that other side of me to shut up. This language might not resonate with you. It depends. Some women are like very gentle and like feminine and flowery, and like, how can you talk that way to yourself? It just works for me. So there's different things that work for different people. But there was a murder involved. Like, this is not a gentle thing. Women are the keepers of life. They're also the keepers of death. And I had to decide to like actively murder that aspect of my thoughts and my mind, and it was very hard. And I kept working through that. And then I remember, I don't know how I knew that I was fully dilated. I think it was the fact that like I had that build up period with no break, where I thought I was going to die, and then it stopped. That's what it was. I had the sensation to push. And I was like, okay, if I'm suddenly getting the urge to push, it's because I'm fully dilated. And look at that. I didn't need a professional, quote unquote professional, to tell me when I was ready to push. I just followed my body's instinctual cues. And I remember being like pushing once and feeling the baby's head like descend. And I was like, whoa, that's weird. I've never been so cognizantly aware of the head like going from the point of the cervix down into the canal. And this is not a very long journey that it has to make. It's only like a couple of inches. I remember being fully dilated with my daughters, and you can stick a finger in to feel their head right there. And it's like right there. It's only like not even an entire finger depth inside. It's right there. This is only like a few inches that it has to travel, which is also really crazy to me. And so I felt his head descend, and then I thought to myself, this is where the shit got crazy in my mind. The one part of me was like, okay, you've rehearsed that you're not going to push too fast when the baby is crowning because you don't want to tear. Like, that's what I was like, be reasonable. Don't push too much or too hard or too fast. Like, just let the baby descend down. And then the other part of me, and I don't even know if this is the good and the bad part, there's just two competing conversations in my mind. The other part of me was like, fuck that. I don't want to experience, I heard some story in the birth course about someone having the baby in the birth canal for 5.5 hours. And I was like, fuck that noise. Like, I'm not having a baby's head in my vagina for 5.5 hours. Kill me before that happens. That's just me. I'm a quick person. Like, let's get this over with quickly. I don't want to just be in the sensation for that long. I don't know. I'm not like that with everything, but with birth, I am. I'm just like, I don't want to milk this. I don't want to sit here with the baby just quote unquote resting their head on my perineum for 5.5 hours. Like, that sounds like literal hell. So, and I was like, the other part of me was like, I don't fucking care if I tear. Get this fucking baby out of me. Like, get it out of me. Like, just get it out. And a lot of moms who've had unmedicated birth will know what I'm talking about when you reach that moment where you're like, just take it out of me, get it out of me. Like, I'm done. That might be, I don't know, hormonal, instinctual, I'm not sure. But in that moment, I made this like super cognizant decision. Yeah, it was very an instinctual decision too. It's just like I just remember being hyper aware of the thought process happening and my body and my mind together being like, let's fucking go. And even if you tear, whatever. And I remember just one more push. So I did the one push where he descended into the canal, and then I was like, one more push, and his head popped out. And it was just like that, like instantaneous. His head was out. And I'm like, how the F did that happen? I didn't tear at all. Nothing, no problems. Just everything just sort of was fluid enough to give way to this. And I was standing in the shower with his head out, being like, oh my fucking God, there's a baby's head. It has come out. And like, I'm acting like it was the first time I've ever given birth, but it's the fourth time. But it's the first time that I've done this on my own with nobody witnessing me, nobody telling me to push, nobody being like, yeah, the heads are that. No one's coercing me, no one's saying it. It's just me. So I'm like, oh my fucking God, there's a head. What I think is a head. And actually, part of my thought process was like, what if this is the butt? Is this a breech birth? Like, oh my God, am I dealing with a breech? And it was pitch black, and all I could feel was like a big round lump. So I'm like, is that its head or its bum or what the hell's going on? And I could have spun out in that moment too. Like the bad wolf could have taken over. I could have spun out. But right away, my body was like, and my mind was like, go stand in the bathtub right now. Like, don't freak out. The head is, or this part, the presenting part, is the hardest part. The rest is going to be easy. It's just going to take one push. Like, just go with this. The worst is over. But you have to, you're not done. Like, this is a very important part, right? You need to get the whole body out. And so I stood in the bathtub, and this is a deep tub, right? It goes like up to my thighs when standing, and then I was mostly like half squatting at this point into it, but I was not, my bum was not in the water, let's just put it that way. So I was standing like the Amazonian tribal woman that I wanted to be. The head was out, what I thought was the head. It ended up being the head, yes. And then I had the sensation to have another contraction, and I decided to push with that sensation. And the baby just flew out, like flew into the water. It was instantaneous. I actually remember thinking, like, this can't be real. This can't have just happened. It couldn't have been that easy. Like, how, like, I was just, because it was all over in an instant, I was like, how was that not more suffering and more pain and more whatever, more torture for me? I was like, this can't be real. Like, this is unbelievable. And just within like a split second, I reached into the water and picked him up and put him to my chest. And like that was that. And we were still connected via the cord, and the cord was long enough to handle coming up to my chest. Um, but I was in a state of like elation slash shock about the whole thing. You know, shock that it was so quick, shock that it's over. You also get a burst of adrenaline when you do give birth, so there's that. Just to like keep you aware and awake and like, hi, you've delivered a baby, make sure it doesn't get eaten by a predator. Like it's all hormonal, but like this is how I was feeling, this sense of almost shock, like, wow, I did it, it's over. And there was no blood, and that's another thing that I reflected on after, when I turned on the lights and like thought the next day. There was no blood. There was like 3 drops on my bathroom floor, and I don't know what that would have come from. What aspect? Like, did I tear a little bit? Was that from like the cord? I have no idea. I have no idea. But there was barely any blood, so it wasn't this bloodbath that people talk about. And I do believe I willed that. Like that was in my visions a lot. And my and I would sit and visualize in the showers. Like, it's not going to be a messy birth. It's going to be a clean birth. Like, there's not going to be blood loss. And so I remember taking the baby and running and getting his dad and being like, holy shit, the baby's born. He didn't even know that I was in labor, right? Like, he didn't even know. And so he's just waking up being like, what? The baby's here? Like, I didn't even know you were going into labor. So that's a little bit shocking, but that's what I needed. I didn't want to be anybody watching me or knowing about what was going on. So that, I can understand some people like, that's not fair to the father and the husband. And like, honestly, if you listen to this rebirth course, it will blow your mind and change how you see that entire situation anyways. And if that is what you truly feel, then of course honor it. But what I truly wanted to honor was this baby, this birth, my body, this pregnancy, and what I knew in the core of my being would be the best way for me to give birth, and the safest way to give birth, which is being unobserved. So that took precedent over the father being aware and awake and present. So you should know that for me. That might be different for you. Um, and he had agreed to this. Like, this wasn't a shocker. I already had told him, I'm not going to tell you unless you're awake already. I'm not going to wake you up. But like, be prepared for whenever that happens. So he was fully aware this is how it's going to go down. And I got him, and he was like shocked, like, oh my God, like, imagine, everything's status quo for many months, and then a woman walks in to where you're sleeping holding a baby. Like, that's weird, right? That's a bit shocking and unsettling for them too. Like, oh my God, there's a baby here. But I also love that. I think it's so cool. Like, I remember when I left, I gave birth to my first daughter at an apartment, and I remember walking out of the apartment a few days later with a baby, and the superintendent being like, "What? There was only one of you living in that apartment, and now there are 2 of you coming out of it. Like, what's going on?" So, I kind of like that. But anyways, he then came, and I was like, "I just need you to cover me with blankets. I need to stay warm." And I had already prepped him that like within an hour, the I would be birthing the placenta. And so I sat with the baby covered in blankets for about 45 minutes. I kept having contractions the entire time, but I was just waiting, waiting, waiting. And the cord looked completely white, completely dry. No blood was left in it. And then finally, I just squatted over a big silver bowl that I had, like a stainless steel bowl that I got at the dollar store. And with the contraction, I just pushed the placenta out, and it's super easy compared to the baby. It's like nothing. But it was good. It was intact. It was well formed. There was no issues. There's definitely no placenta left behind. And I was super happy that it was the first birth where no one's manually ripping out my placenta. And then I'm gushing blood everywhere. I did bleed a little bit at this point, but nothing major. I told my body, like, you're going to shut off all the blood vessels. You're going to cleave the placenta off. You're going to, like, be fine. Because the power of the mind over the body is actually quite substantial. So it was minimal bleeding. And then, yeah, he latched. He had a lot of issues with breastfeeding. in the beginning. We got that addressed quite early on with getting his tongue tie released by a pediatric dentist. I'm not going to say it was like perfect because none of my children have latched well and done well in the beginning, but that's the story of it. That's the story of how it went down. From start to finish, it was like 8:30 p.m. until 11 p.m. He was born. when I when I got out of the bathtub and I was holding him, it was 11:02. And so I assumed that I gave birth about 2 minutes prior, which is 11 o'clock on the dot. But he could have been born at 11:01. I don't know. One of those minutes was his minutes to be born, and that's when I had went to get his dad and tell him when he was born. So, yeah, that was the birth story for me, and that was quite interesting. And I just remember when it was all over, I was like, I fucking did it. Like, I did it. I did what I said I was going to do. The visualization that I did for many weeks helped a lot. That other wolf fully died in that moment. I'm sure they're not. I'm sure they'll be resurrected and always make appearances in my life. But it was just astonishing to me that I won. Like the wolf that I wanted won the battle, and I didn't give in, and I coached myself through it, and it really sort of bolstered my self-belief in that moment. And it was really tough for me because I felt like I was so diseased at the end. Like I had so many varicose veins, I had a lot of pain from the veins, I had so much heartburn. These are the sort of things that offer this very blaring pain that interrupts your quality of life every single day, all day long. Even when you're sleeping, you're having heartburn. No matter how much Gaviscon I took, I should have bought stocks in Gaviscon. So I had this like glaring pain from multiple things that made me feel like my body is so flawed and diseased, like I can't possibly give birth naturally on my own as a free birth. But truthfully, those things are not red flags and they're quite superficial in nature. And my body was able to do what it needed to do. And I had to hold that faith that like it's just going to do what it needs to do anyways. And I don't know, a lot of me did it for my daughters and for my daughter-in-law if I ever have one. It's just I feel like how can I help future generations if I can't walk that path first? And I understand it's not everyone's path to walk, but it's what I feel called to walk. And I felt a lot of reclamation around what my great grandmother would have been doing, which was similar to a free birth on the farm with three of her kids, one of whom was born when she was 43 years old. So I really feel like things have been lost. Things have been lost, especially in the boomer generation and the one right before it, like my grandmother and my mom's generation. Things have been lost. We've been medicalized. Women have been treated like garbage. There's just so much to this that I can't even cover in a singular podcast. But there's an act of reclamation happening where we're trying to integrate what's new and what's good and what does work with the old things that have been lost that need to come back. One of those being free birth and being able to birth on your own and being able to be revered, both revering yourself and having others revere you because of the female capacity to bring life onto the planet. That just was really important to me. It was really important to me to go through this and to have this. And I also feel like it helped me heal the prior experiences that I had during my births that were not what I wanted them to be. Of course, everyone who goes through this then says something like, I wish my first birth was a free birth, etc. A lot of people say that. And some people will be lucky enough that all of their births, their first birth included, will be free births and wild pregnancies, if that's what suits them, if that's what they want. But I always think, if we move too far away from the fact that we are animals and we integrate technology too much, what happens if this all collapses? And like, what happens if we created a society that is completely dependent, like literally life or death dependent on technology? If we can't birth our own young, that's a problem with our species. That's a major problem. And I find it hard to believe that women truly have narrow hips or whatever the case is, that they can't have babies. I think there's other things going on. I do think it's happening more and more that we're creating a society where it's harder to give birth naturally. But I think it's more in the mind than anything else. And the lack of preparation and the lack of wanting to, and the very good job that society has done at brainwashing us to thinking that birth is hard and scary and needs to be helped and needs to be medicalized and assisted by a doctor. Like I said, every movie I watched that depicts birth as like this struggle, and then Game of Thrones is like so many deaths, and whatever the show that came after of it was the Dragon Show. Like again, there's like multiple infant losses and death during childbirth. It's just like this is what people think, especially men, because the writer of that show is a man, and or he is just an easy way to kill off characters in that day and age, I guess, in the writing. But it's that's what's embedded in our psyche. And I needed to write a new story for myself and for my daughters and their daughters. You know, there's a high chance that my daughters won't want anything to do with it, but maybe in the sense that I'm trying to reclaim what my great grandmother did, maybe that'll be me for my great granddaughter someday, many, many years from now. I'm going to wrap it up here because that's all I have to say about all of that. I hope it was a benefit to anybody listening or of interest. And like I said, there's a lot more. If you want to explore the data and the evidence around birth and the different ways that it is medicalized and the different ways, like how effective are the different interventions, I would highly recommend the book Gentle Birth, Gentle Mothering by Dr. Sarah J. Buckley. She's an obstetrician in Australia, I believe, or New Zealand. I think it's Australia. She literally will walk you through every single intervention and the pros and the cons of it, the statistics behind it. So that book is good. And then the free birth course is really good. It was like $200. I think it's normally 400. And they also go through the research and then their own opinions on the topics. So there's that. So if you want to learn more about those aspects, I would seek out those resources and follow the Free Birth Society podcast too. Listen to that. And their Instagram was really cool. So that's all I have to say. That was my experience. I'm just sharing my own story. I'm not suggesting that anybody do this. It would have to be your own decision that you've come to on your own, but it was really powerful for me. A lot of people keep asking me questions like how do you deliver your own baby? How is that even possible? I kind of find it disgusting, and I have found it disgusting from day one that anybody else ever delivers somebody's baby. Like obviously it's whatever you want, but when my when I was talking about my first birth, my first midwife, I told her, I was like, I want to deliver the baby. I want to deliver my own baby. I don't want you touching. Why do you have to pull a baby out of my vagina and put it on my chest? Like, do people help you poo? Like, does someone come and pull your own poo out of your butt? I know it's a disgusting and not accurate example, but like it feels that level of invasive to me. It feels invasive, like this is a private thing. And it also feels like you're suggesting my body isn't capable of what it's designed to do. Like there's something inherently flawed and wrong about me, and that I'm disabled in some sense. That you have to pull something out of my body like that and then put it on my chest. It's so strange. It's so strange. I find it offensive. That's just my own personal opinion. I find other people delivering my baby to be offensive, and I'm glad that I delivered my own baby, and I'm astonished at the amount of questions that I get about like how did you deliver your own baby? It's first of all, it's called birthing the baby, not delivering. I birthed the baby into water and then I picked him up. Like easy peasy lemon squeezy. So that, and then a lot of people were like, how did you deliver your own placenta? If you can, quote unquote, deliver your own baby, you can, quote unquote, deliver your own placenta. Like, it's just crazy to me. It's crazy. It's, these questions show how deeply brainwashed we are, like, for lack of a better word. And I was right there with you. I would have asked these questions 2 years ago. I would have said the same thing, like, not about the placenta, but just in general, I would have had these sorts of questions about like, are we allowed to give birth by ourselves? Are you allowed to? Like, it's absurd. Once you start to learn the truth, you learn that this whole thing is a built up fake lie. Like it's just a lie. It's not real. But we've been brainwashed to believe that this is what you have to do. You have to go to the hospital. You have to get an OB. You have to get a midwife. Of course, like there's no other choice. But there's actually a lot of choice. It's your own body and you can do with it what you want. And once you learn that, you start to hear these questions and you're like, this is insane. It's insane how much we think our power has been taken away from us, and we're just all a collective group of farm animals that need to be. And do the farm animals even require? No, you don't. You probably don't need to pull cows out of baby cows out of big cows. I don't know. This is not my field of expertise. Don't quote me. But how many animals give birth in the wild on their own completely fine without assistance? So why are you making us feel like human cattle, who probably also shouldn't be meddled with anyway? So that's just food for thought. I think it's insane. Now that I know what I know, I think it's insane how we've treated birth and how we treat women. And I guess the last big point that I'll say that I've thought about a lot is women, you know, I'm not I'm not like a feminist per se, but I do see that women's power has been taken away from them quite a bit throughout this patriarchal existence. And I think it's due to this fact that we give birth and we have the power to give birth and bring life onto the planet. And it is quite a spiritual experience because you're releasing the types of hormones that would connect you to spiritual experiences. And that's something that men don't get to access. And I think there's been fear around our power of giving birth. And I believe it's like one of the biggest places where we can reclaim our power because it's one of the places where it's taken away the most. And if you decide that I don't want to partake in that anymore, I don't want to partake in having my power be diminished because it's such an instant 180-degree turn. It's like you could feel like an absolute warrior goddess woman who just brought life into this world and who's in total control of her body and her life. Control is not the right word, but like you're with it, you're aligned with it, you're acting with it, you're acting along with your instincts. There's a power to this, and there's a power to the decision making that comes from it. Or you could feel like this disabled patient strapped to a hospital bed whose body is flawed, who can't give birth on its own, who's given all of her power away to a doctor just because he or she said so. And the way that you walk away from that experience impacts the rest of your life. You can't say that it doesn't. You can't say that it doesn't burrow a nest in your subconscious psyche and have an impact on you. Like here I was during what could have been the most powerful event of my life, and it was highly medicalized, not even by my own choice, but just this was what was forced upon me. And that's what eats away at a person subconsciously. Like my power was taken away. This experience was taken away. Not only was it taken away, but like the complete opposite was given to me, where I was shown that I was, not just neutral, but completely not powerful, completely weak, completely disabled, completely can't trust my body, myself, my mind, my psyche. So to me, it remains an area where women's power can be taken away instantly and can impact her for the duration of her lifetime thereafter, unless she does work around that and healing that. And we can't say that this doesn't have an impact on our children too, and how we parent and our relationships. Birth affects everything. And the way you do anything is the way you do everything, they say, right? I don't know how true that is, but I do know that this has an impact, or can have, and often does have an impact on other areas of our lives. And so it's sad to me that women are treated this way, and what is lost that could have been experienced during this aspect of our lives. So that was the last big thing that I think about, and I think that it was a period of reclamation for me, and to see that my body is not as diseased and damaged as I thought that it was. It is strong. It does have strength inside of the challenges. I do have power. I don't need somebody else outside of me to tell me how things are or what to do. I don't need an authority over my body or my health. I benefit from consulting with experts at times. Absolutely, I do. But that's much different than having somebody else be an authority over my body, right? There's just a whole different perception about that. So, in short, Jordan was born on April 25th, a Thursday at 11 o'clock on the dot. His head came out in the shower and his body came out in the bathtub. So, I gave birth in the dark, standing like the Amazonian tribal women that I read about, all alone, and that was the best possible outcome for me. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know. And thank you so much for listening to this story. And thank you for contributing your stories if you're a woman who's shared your story. Yeah, I'm glad to be back in a sense of contributing this podcast, and I hope to record more. And in the meantime, let's stay in touch on social media. Bye for now.